Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very well-recognized and respected architect and a multifaceted individual from Chicago, USA, Mr. Randy Deutsch. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Randy is an educator, author, international keynote speaker, artificial intelligence researcher, and a licensed architect. He has designed over 100 large, complex, sustainable projects. He's received the AIA Young Architect Award in Chicago, and he's the author of 6 books. The most recent one being Convergence, the Redesign of Design. So, Randy, let's start by asking you, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
Sure, absolutely. I grew up, as you mentioned, in Chicago, and Louis Kahn, a famous architect from many years ago, said that a city is a place where a young child can go and know what they want to do with the rest of their life. And Chicago was that for me. So just living in a city as beautiful, as impactful and strong, definitely had an impression on me. But in addition to that, I had a lot of interests as a young child. I loved to draw, to paint, to model, to design, even to write. And it occurred to me that no one of those is going to be fulfilling for a long career. Architecture appeared to me, when I learned about it eventually in my teens, to be sort of an all-encompassing field or profession where it can really keep you on your toes for a very long time. There's just, you can't possibly know everything. And so it was that idea that I think really stuck with me.
Fascinating. And what got you initially interested in architecture, and what made you pursue it as a career? Because you've done so many other things.
Yeah, so it's this idea that it requires you to be very well-rounded. It requires you to be inquisitive. There's a lot of preconceived ideas that I think we have about what it takes to be an architect, like knowing math and being able to draw. And the reality is there's so much to it. The fact that you are protecting the public in buildings, making sure that they are safe, all the way to wanting to inspire people who live around the buildings. I took that to be a challenge, one that would take an entire career to pursue. And then, like yourself, find an opportunity at some point in my career to give back. And in this field, there's a lot of transferable skills that can help inspire and encourage others.
Fascinating. And can you share with us some key moments or some projects in your career that have helped you become so highly awarded and recognized?
Thank you. I actually think they come from humble beginnings and more than career highlights. One that comes to mind, I can think of 2. So one that comes to mind is my very first day of the very first job I ever had as an architect. I listened in as my boss, the head of the team and project, described a project, a large-scale development they were working on. And, not knowing that I wasn't supposed to say anything, I blurted out, "Why is the entry to the project over here? Why not move it over there?" And then there was dead silence. Nobody said a word. And it turned out, one by one, they started to say, "Wow, that's a really good idea. It would save money. It would make the project go faster, fewer regulations involved, and so on." And what occurred to me is that's an advantage that you have when you first start off, beginner's mind. And what I've tried to do throughout my career is to stay in that state of beginner's mind every day, even 40 years into working in practice and teaching and writing and architecture. I try to still have that mindset. The second one, real quickly, really has to do with this ability to zoom in and zoom out. Our firm at that time was going after an architectural competition, and we wanted to put up a skyscraper or a high-rise in Chicago amongst all the others. And my boss really didn't want to work on a competition, said either invite us to design a building or don't, but we're not going to compete against, our colleagues. It occurred to me, though, that if you zoomed out and you really thought about this particular location on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, if you thought about the community and the larger community and so on, it occurred to me that there's a sort of an obvious solution of what you could do there, and one that would appeal to him and his values as well. So we went ahead and entered the competition. We won it, and I walked throughout Chicago every week and am able to see this high-rise that went up. So those are a couple of key highlights.
How wonderful. In fact, I've often said that architects have the joy of being able to see their creation, and it lasts for generations. So
you hope it does.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. So my next question, Randy, is that what, in your opinion, are some of the important qualities an architect needs to have to be successful?
So again, I think a lot of people don't enter architecture because they say they're not good in math or they don't draw. But the reality is there's actually other qualities that will really help you in a long, fulfilling, rewarding career in architecture. And, the first and foremost is active listening, not just keeping your mouth shut when someone else is talking, but actually to stay engaged and involved when somebody's talking. Another one is empathy, the ability to be able to feel and have compassion for those who you are working with and those you're going to be building for and their communities. And this includes, of course, future generations. So to be able to empathize with others, I think is incredibly important. That way, you're able to put what you want to put on the site into perspective, because others will have to live with it. Others really have to do with maintaining curiosity throughout your career, staying interested. One that we don't often think about in architecture is storytelling, the ability to be able to capture something that's very complex and could take a long time, to explain, and be able to tell it in a narrative or story form. So it helps people go down the path with you and helps them make decisions. One last one very quickly, which I don't think we ever talk about in school, is the ability to synthesize. You have a lot of people with their own interests in what should happen in a building project. And you're the architect. You're the one who needs to listen to it could be 100, it could be 200 different personal interest, points of view. And you need to bring it all together into a cohesive whole. Otherwise, what you're going to deliver is going to be very chaotic. So this idea of synthesis or synthesizing is one that I think is going to be very important, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence in the future.
Fantastic. And, since you just mentioned artificial intelligence, that's a good segue to my next question, which is that how have you seen technology change architecture, and how do you incorporate a lot of this technology into your designs?
Yeah, so there's two different ways of looking at technology in our field. One is as a process, and one is in terms of the product, the building. And very quickly, just in terms of the process, I've made it my goal in my career to help bring up the future generations of architects to get comfortable with leveraging tools and recognizing what these tools are, not running away from them and being afraid of them, but finding what they can do to help their projects, help their careers, but also help those, who will be living with the buildings that you design. So that's, I think, really important. We don't talk about process really that much. In terms of the product itself, I think we talk a great deal, or you see it in the media, about smart buildings and smart cities on the rise. I think technology is really important with the rise of climate change and many other issues that we have today in terms of what we call building performance. If we can leverage sensors and software and drones and other tools that are available to us to help design buildings that are good for the environment, that won't waste energy. Buildings use 40% of all the energy available to us on the planet. And so anything we can do to counter that will be beneficial. So we do have tools available to us today as a profession in the industry, and us for those who don't make the best use of them.
And when it comes to designing a building, I'm not an architect, but from whatever little I've read and when I was preparing to talk to you, there's the whole issue of aesthetics and functionality, and which has to be considered. And on top of that, there are your stakeholders who must have got their own ideas about how to design a building. So what goes into designing a building?
Sure. So it's a challenge. There's no question that this is something, when you're in school, you focus almost exclusively on the aesthetics, and then you get out in the field into practice, and more practical concerns become important, like functionality and how the building's going to perform and work for the client and others. So it is a balancing act. That said, I think we do downplay aesthetics. We as human beings for tens of thousands of years have developed our aesthetic sense. People also take what you might call pride of place. In other words, they're very proud of where they live, and they want to make sure that the building doesn't sit out like a sore thumb, or if it does so for a very important reason, like to call attention to certain things. I think, going back to Louis Sullivan's original saying, a form follows function, it's not a bad rule to follow. It doesn't really matter what order we go in, but if you take care of functionality first and then address form after that, that's actually, a good process. I have a slightly different twist on it. I call it roots and wings. And what I mean by that is, if the design that you are coming up with addresses the roots, the foundations, what's really important to people, then all you will deliver, if that's all you do, will be a building, not a piece of architecture with a capital A. So the building also needs to have wings, and obviously not literally, but it needs to transcend that foundation. It needs to do something more. So it's not a particular aesthetic. It's not trying to espouse or push on other people your aesthetic, but it needs to do something to transcend the particular problem you were given to solve to begin with. Roots and wings.
Very interesting. And this roots and wings thing also may be something that I wanted to ask you about. And, very often you see a building and say, this building has a lot of character. What does the word character mean when you define a building?
Yeah, so character really, to me personally, it's very refined, or it is the last stage in what a building can do. So in other words, we think in terms of 4 larger stages when we design. One is organizing the spaces and the information. One has to do 3-dimensionally with organizing the massing.
Right.
A third one has to do with the image. What image does this building have? Is it a friendly, approachable building? Is it overpowering or overtowering? And so those are the first 3. The last one is where we start to get into the decisions having to do with what architects call materiality, but I think human beings call materials, where we start talking about what are the materials, what are the finishes, what are the textures for this building? Is it friendly and approachable? Do I know where to place my hands if it's on, let's say, natural wood, or is there a rougher, brutalist concrete texture where you're supposed to look and your eyes are supposed to dance around, but you're not supposed to touch it, and so on. That's what I think of when I think of character.
Fascinating. My next question to you, Randy, is that when you approach buildings which may have some kind of a historical value or a historical structure, how do you manage to preserve the integrity of that old structure while bringing in or incorporating modern design elements that are needed for our contemporary requirements?
It's funny, MBAs, those with business degrees at my university, respond to questions like that with, it depends. So I'm going to go ahead and play the MBA card here.
Okay.
And say, There are times when you need to determine whether the historic structure actually has qualities that are worth carrying forward. There are times where a building is just, I hate to say it, they're just old.
Yeah.
And you need to bring them up to date. Vast majority of projects need to be renovated or restored or through adaptive reuse given a new life. And there's a saying, and that is the most sustainable building is an existing building. And so we take it very seriously when we work with historic structures to determine what are the qualities that you want to continue and play up. And if it's not a museum quality building, if you can call it that, if it's not a piece of architecture where the entire building is really worth restoring, then there are parts of the project that you can bring up to date. Now, obviously, there's parts of the project you can bring up to date, and you should, through the building codes and zoning to make it habitable and usable for people today. But there's also parts that are more overt, out in the open, that you want to bring up to date. And if it's not a museum quality historic structure that you're restoring, I think you should be, this will be controversial for a historic preservation architect, but you should, as a designer, have the opportunity to bring that building up to date. A lot of times, in summary, I would say a lot of times there are some contemporary interventions you can make with older architecture that actually brings attention to the older architecture. A lot of times we live amongst some really beautiful older buildings, but it's not until you introduce something contemporary that people then actually for the first time see the older qualities of the historic buildings.
Amazing. Thank you. What a great response. Even though it's an MBA response, as you said. Randy, the other thing that I wanted to also ask you is that, every building seems to get ownership from the communities that it is in. And therefore, there is a love-hate relationship that exists between, communities and the buildings that they have. How do you ensure your projects respond to the needs of communities?
Yeah, so going back to what I said a moment ago about active listening, I think even more importantly, just as an attitude, I don't recommend focus groups, but I do recommend talking to those who will be using the building, talking to those who will be the neighbors and the public at large, to get them to open up and voice their concerns and their interests, because you as a designer, as a synthesizer of disparate or different points of view and inputs, are already adept at taking in all these different points of view and data inputs. I think there's another way of looking at it. So again, instead of focus groups, think of it in terms of ethnographic research, where you're literally going out and observing people. How do they currently walk around the site? How do they currently use the site before you introduce your intervention? And I think just being able to observe with your eyes and listen with your ears, you again are responsible not just for the building users that the owner represents and the neighbors and the public at large, but you as the architect are responsible for future generations that aren't even born yet. And so keeping that in mind, ethically, you have on your shoulders a lot of responsibility here. You need to zoom in and zoom out and think in terms of how will this building be used in the future? Can you make it more adaptable so people can reinterpret and use it as technologies and economies change? So I think these are important ways to make sure that the projects you're introducing are less controversial and more engaging and useful for everybody.
Fascinating. So one more question relating to architecture, and then I want to talk about your books. How has your own design philosophy evolved over the course of your career? I mean, are there any architects or designers who have particularly influenced you?
Sure. So my philosophy has stayed strangely similar from the time when I was in school over 40 years ago to now. And that really has to do with, at the beginning of every project, asking 4 questions. What is actual? What's there at the site? What are you working with? And what are you not working with that you need? what is necessary? So you go to the client and you ask them, what is necessary to make your project into a building? And then if you're lucky enough to have a budget and a schedule that will enable you to actually include desires, you ask the public, you ask everybody involved, what's desirable? And the best of all possible concerns, what would you desire to be here today? Lastly, and this is to me the ultimate responsibility of the architect, nobody else can answer this question, and that is the fourth question, what is possible? So in addition to what's actual, necessary, and desirable, what is possible? I mean, only you will alone know what the technologies are that are out there, what you can do with these different materials and budget and schedule that you've been given, and points of view and data points and so on. There have been architects, in the second part of the question, that have influenced me over time. Going back 40 or 50 years, Aldo van Eyck and Herman Hertzberger were architects who were very much humanists. They were structuralists in that they did address the bones or the foundations of buildings in a very basic way, but at the same time, they made sure that their buildings were scaled, let's say, for children who are going to use schools. They came out of the Netherlands and Amsterdam in particular, and they had a huge influence on me. Today, there are three architects, all coincidentally out of California, or architecture firms, Michael Piatak, David Baker, and Brooks Scarpa, three firms out of California that address affordable housing without giving up the aesthetics. Their projects win awards. The neighbors that they work with in participatory design, where they do meet with the neighbors, they're able to take their designs and deliver buildings that are affordable, truly affordable, even in California, and at the same time are absolutely gorgeous, are worthy of being in a museum.
Amazing, amazing. I'd like to now move to your books. You're an author of 6 books, and your most recent one is Convergence, the Redesign of Design. Tell me about your latest book, and what was your hypothesis when you wrote it?
Sure. And, my apology for, I've actually written books so quickly over the last decade. I've written 3 books since then. So in 2019, I wrote a book called Super Users. And then during the pandemic, I wrote 2 books, one called Think Like an Architect, and the second one, Adapt as an Architect. I'll focus just for a moment on super users. Who do we, yes, as architects, but as all individuals, who do we need to be moving forward in our careers, in the world, to tackle intractable, wicked problems like climate change, but also social and racial justice? Who do, even the rise of technology, who do we need to be to address these things? A super user, unlike the name implies, has 10 qualities, and 9 out of the 10 are mindsets, attitudes, and soft skills, like the ability to communicate and collaborate and cooperate with others. And only one, the comfort with being able to lift the hood on a tool or software tool, the ability to code, is a technology tool. I think many of us have had incredible parents, and we've been raised really well. And so we have these soft skills and these mindsets and attitudes that will help us move forward in our careers, no matter what your career is. Unfortunately, and this is why I wrote the book, some of us really didn't benefit, let's say, growing up from these. And so we aren't taught them in school. And so the book became a refresher in a way. It's the most popular of my 6 books, Super Users. And it's caught on because I think intuitively we realize that we're not going to be able to outthink AI, but we will be able to work with these tools and with each other as long as we continue to emphasize our very human qualities, like you're doing on this webcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my last question to you, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey, not just as an architect, but as an educator, an author, a researcher, as a speaker, what would you say are 3 lessons that you would want a lot of our viewers and listeners to take away?
Yeah, if any of my students are listening in, they'll roll their eyes because they hear me say these all the time. So the first one is how you do anything is how you do everything. So you cannot just put 100% into what you're passionate about and then let everything else slide. You have to bring everything up to the same level.
Correct.
And I don't say that to create stress. I just say it because it's really true in life. That you want to be consistent, you want to be trusted and valued. You will put that same level of quality into everything. A second one is, it's actually the opening of my second to last book, Think Like an Architect. And it's telling the reader that you may be talented as a designer and adept at using the latest technology, but you have some room for improvement when it comes to one particular tool, and that is our thinking tool. And specifically in the book, I talk about critical thinking, creative thinking, and collaborative thinking. I think we have the opportunity to really leverage our thinking a lot more than we currently are. And the third one is actually a quote from the novelist and literary writer Henry James from 100 years ago. Try to be someone, or try to be one of those on whom nothing is lost. And that includes the listeners and the watchers of your webcast. Try to listen in, be a sponge, take in as much as you can. There are so many opportunities around us that a lot of times we're preoccupied with the thoughts in our head and we don't write things down. So it means just be open, listen, observe all the time. We're constantly growing. There's even, that famous quote from Mark Twain that don't let your formal education get in the way of your actual education. Yes, thank you for that question.
Yeah. And on that note, Randy, and your 3 amazing lessons, such powerful lessons. How you do anything is how you do everything. That's amazing. Second, you said the thinking tool is so critical, and we've got to be able to sharpen our own thinking tools very, very significantly. And the third one is be a person on whom nothing is lost. Again, so critical and so important. Thank you, Randy, for talking to me about your journey. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of architecture. I loved your Architecture 101, which you said active listening, empathy, curiosity, storytelling, and synthesized thinking. Thank you for speaking to me about modern buildings, about technology, and about your books. Thank you again, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.